Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Special Policy Forum today on countering the Houthi threat to shipping. I'm Patrick Clausen. I'm the Director of Research here at the Washington Institute, and I'll be moderating today's event. We have three exciting speakers. First comes Noam Raidan, who's a senior fellow here at the Washington Institute, and she's the co-author of an interactive map, which we just released on tracking attacks through the region. So you can go to our website, find that map, and I think you'll be very interested by the information that it contains. Then we will have Michael Knights, who's the Washington Institute's Bernstein Fellow, and he's the co-founder of our Militia Spotlight platform. And he is also the author of a new study on an heir and a spare, how Yemen's southern Hezbollah could change Iran's deterrent calculus. And I urge you to go to our website and look at that. Then finally, we will have Simon Henderson, who is the Baker Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of its Bernstein program on Gulf and energy policy. So after the three speakers, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you want to ask questions of our participants during the event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function, which is the bottom of your screen. Or if you're watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum, one great big long word, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. And with that, let me turn to Noam.
Thank you very much, Patrick. If our map is ready and you can show it, that would be great. First, I would like to start with our new map, the one Patrick mentioned. We did launch it today, and as the viewers can see it on screen, this is a map which Farzin Nadimi, a Washington Institute expert, and myself and others worked on. In it, we track attacks that have been taking place in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, Persian Gulf, and other areas in the region since at least 2019. But today, of course, we would like to focus on the attacks that have been launched by the Houthis since November 19. We have counted at least 27 confirmed and identified commercial ships since November 19th again. Those have been attacked by the Houthis. The first one was hijacked in mid-November, and it's the car carrier Galaxy Leader, which remains in Yemen along with the crew. And since the US and the UK started their strikes on military targets in Yemen on January the 12th, around 10 identified and confirmed ships have been targeted by the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden and the southern Red Sea. And this is a clear sign that the attacks on the international shipping and seafarers continue up until now. And just today, another attack was reported of Hodeidah in the southern Red Sea. The Houthis have targeted different types of vessels, container ships, oil, chemical tankers, bulk carriers, and car carriers. Different commodities pass through the Red Sea Suez Canal that handle around 12% of global trade. The ships have been targeted so far are owned, managed, operated by various international companies. Since January the 12th, the attacks appear to have been targeted or aimed at US or vessels with US and UK links. Now, as a reaction to the Houthi attacks, over 10 global shipping companies have decided to halt transit through Gulf of Aden and southern Red Sea. And if we could please start with the first slide, just to explain to viewers the changing or the new trade patterns that are taking place in the region, that would be very helpful. I will begin with the container ship Copiapo. This ship left Greece on December the 28th, sailing to Jabal Ali in UAE, and it took it a month and a few days to get to its destination. It arrived today. That's a month and a few days instead of going through the Suez Canal. Moving to slide 2, MSC Amelia. MSC Amelia left Port Said in Egypt also on January the 12th, and she is expected to reach Abu Dhabi on February the 13th. As you can see, those are very long journeys, especially when the ships avoid going through the Suez Canal. Usually a voyage through the Suez Canal would take the ship about 13 to 15 days. Moving to slide 3, we see Al Gharia. This is a Qatari LNG. Again, I'm trying just to show you how different types of vessels. Al Gharia left Qatar, Ras Laffan on January the 11th, and she's expected to reach Las Palmas in Spain on February the 3rd. And the last one is Ever Apex coming from Asia, Singapore. Also left on January the 9th, as viewers can see, and she's expected in Rotterdam later this month. As the maps show, those are very long journeys around the Cape of Good Hope. More than 10 shipping companies have decided to take that route instead of going through the Red Sea due to the attacks. However, it is very important to note that not all ships are going around the Cape of Good Hope. There are others that are still transiting the region. And let's move please to the next slide. An example is Sama Sajam Jacques Saadi. This is owned by the French company Sama Sajam. Sama Sajam is also a major container shipping company that is still sending some of its ships through the Red Sea. And Sama Sajam Jacques Saadi is going to Singapore. If you remember, we earlier saw a map showing how some tankers are going around the Cape of Good Hope to get to Singapore, but this one is actually still going through the Suez Canal. And the last example is going to be Palmer. Palmer is a crude oil tanker coming from a Russian port, and recently she passed through the Suez Canal, and most likely this ship is going to Asia. Again, while vessels are still going through Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Southern Red Sea, traffic is not the same. Traffic has been declining, especially as more ships go around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, if we move to the chart that we've prepared using data from Lloyd's List Intelligence, excuse me, we can see how the weekly transits around Cape of Good Hope have changed and have been increasing since the past few months and up until now. And they've increased up to 588 transits by the end of January, compared, for instance, to 395 in mid-December. In the meantime, if we look at Suez, to take a look at the downward trend, we can notice how transits have been declining since, we can say, December and up until now. And if the crisis persists, probably more ships will be taking the Cape of Good Hope, excuse me. Again, I repeat that some ships are still going through the region, but others are staying. And we have small operators who probably might be also seeing an opportunity to continue operating vessels in the Red Sea at the time when others are staying away from the region. Major companies for now seem that they don't see safety of navigation being restored anytime soon, and that's why they are staying away from the region, especially at the time when the Houthi attacks appear to have widened in scope, intensity, and lethality. And you can, again, check our map on the website just to see how those attacks have been changing since November 2023. And lastly, just to recap, the attacks have created new trade patterns, and it's very important to continue monitoring those trade patterns over the next few months. And in the meantime, the Houthi threat to international shipping cannot be ignored in the future, because there could be a possibility that we might see this threat being used in the future and under different circumstances. And I will leave this to my colleague, Mike Knights, our expert on this issue, to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noam. Now let's turn to Mike Knights. Tell us something about the Houthis' military plans.
So thanks very much for having me. I'm going to talk very briefly about, what can potentially be done to change Houthi capabilities or intentions to mess with shipping, both now and in the future. Within the axis of resistance, which includes Iran, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, Houthis, and Hamas, the Houthis have used this war as a sort of social mobility platform. They have gone from being a part of the axis of resistance that might be considered peripheral or not that important to the only member within the axis of resistance that has actually credibly assisted Hamas by globalizing this conflict and giving it an actual price tag for the international global economy. They're the ones who, if you think about it, Iran has never fired a medium-range ballistic missile at Israel. The Houthis have done it at least 3 times since this conflict started. They're the ones who are proving themselves to be the most committed member of the axis of resistance. So they've enjoyed this enormously. Now, a lot of people ask, so are they independent of Iran? Can Iran affect their decision-making? If you go to West Point Combating Terrorism Center, we did a piece at the Washington Institute, I think in October of 2022, if I'm remembering right, which was called the Houthi Jihad Council. And it was about the internal decision-making structure of the Houthi security leadership, which is modeled entirely on Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah models, including having a Jihad Council at the center, on which sits a Revolutionary Guard Jihad assistant and a Lebanese Hezbollah deputy Jihad assistant. The Houthis don't need to be told what to do by the Iranians because they themselves are fully on board with the idea of expanding the Islamic Revolution, developing a Southern Hezbollah type movement on which they modeled themselves. They modeled themselves on Lebanese Hezbollah, and they have enormous respect for Hezbollah as a kind of older sibling and for Iran as a kind of parent. The Houthis, if the Iranians were unwise enough to tell the Houthis to do something that would remove their control of northern Yemen, then the Houthis might say no. They would say no, probably. But the Iranians don't need to do that. What they're asking the Houthis to do is stuff that's within their own objectives and often in their own interests. So the Iranians don't push on a closed door. That's something they do across the board. They won't do that. They don't put their partners in that kind of position. But if the Iranians say the Gaza conflict has wound down, we have been there from day one to the last day, we did all the honor required, and now it's good for the axis of resistance if we all power down, take stock, and work out what the next stage of resistance is going to look like. Well, the Houthis are not going to say, no, we're enjoying this too much. We're getting too much global profile from this. They're going to power down as well. So the end of the Gaza conflict is significant. I'm not saying that because one should alter the way the Gaza conflict concludes merely to stop the Houthis from attacking. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I am saying is I would expect when Gaza moves to something recognizably different, a new phase, including reconstruction and readmittance of the population to parts of Gaza where they're not currently, I think at that point, the Houthis with the rest of the axis of resistance will power down and they'll be quite content with what they've achieved. But what I also think is true is that if we get a sequel operation in Lebanon, whereby the Israelis, perhaps this year, but more likely next year, decide to do something about Lebanese Hezbollah forces south of the Litani, in that conflict, the Houthis would undoubtedly be heavily involved and possibly even more committed than they have been in this particular crisis. Because if anything, they are extremely close to Lebanese Hezbollah, which is a mentor and a partner, and the only external force that the Houthis don't bridle at their influence, don't feel a sort of a xenophobic impulse to shake off their influence. They're actually very close to Lebanese Hezbollah. So finishing off, what do we do about this Houthi issue? There's 3 answers, I think, and each one of them is imperfect. One of them is to deplete their arsenal and to defend against them until Gaza has switched to that new level and the axis of resistance is powered down. And that is a viable option. The fact is, international shipping is not going to come back very quickly anyway. Possibly not before the end of a Gaza conflict. The Houthis are using up their limited amount of anti-shipping munitions. They're under far closer surveillance than they've ever been before, and we're having a pretty good rate of success in terms of disrupting major attacks and removing those systems from the Houthi arsenal. And they're probably not getting resupplied the same way they were before. We've had some quite significant finds and interceptions recently, and if we keep doing that, the natural progression there is that the Houthis will run out of the sort of weapon systems that they've been using to attack ships effectively. They'll still be able to throw a lot of ineffective attacks. We'll have to cope with that. International shippers will have to decide at some point if they're ineffective enough for them to go back in. But ultimately, option one is to deplete and defend. And that's what we're doing. Option two is to coerce Iran. Realistically, the best way to make the Houthis stop doing what they're doing sooner than they want to is to make the Iranians feel that there is a cost to Iran for that tactic. And that could be done in a number of ways, including sinking Iranian ships and attacking the Iranian homeland or other sneaky stuff. The third option is to directly coerce the Houthis. And I say this third because I think it's the hardest option. The Saudis tried for 9 years. The Yemeni government tried the previous 10 years before that. They took the head of the Houthi movement and they shot him in the head in a summary execution. And that didn't stop them, nor did targeting their leadership or destroying their home city in Sada. What would stop them? Well, potentially, if one could build, or at least threaten to build, a credible military force within Yemen that could significantly damage them and shift the military balance against them, which is actually a very easy thing to do in Yemen, then that might be something that they very much wanted to avoid. And so if one said, if these attacks continue, we're going to activate a security assistance program that will significantly change the military balance of power on multiple fronts within Yemen within the next couple of years. And once we start doing it, we're not going to stop doing it. We've built partner forces in tough environments like northeastern Syria and other places. We can easily do it in Yemen. And from my perspective, that's pretty much the only thing they really fear. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to my esteemed colleague, Simon, to talk about the Gulf aspects in this, which I guess fit quite well with the idea of potentially increasing security assistance in Yemen.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now let's turn to Simon, who will walk us through the calculations of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries regarding the situation in Yemen.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Michael and Noah. We're in an extraordinary situation. The United States, as well as Britain, have been arming the Gulf countries, our Gulf allies, for many years, often providing top-of-the-range equipment. And yet, when a crisis happens like we're in at the moment, where are they? And the answer is they're not participating, except perhaps, at least in name, Bahrain, because that's where the headquarters is of the US Fifth Fleet, and NAVCENT, the Central Command Naval Forces. Instead, the military action in the Red Sea against Houthi forces, trying to keep the sea lanes open, is being principally taken on by the United States with some support from the Royal Navy of Britain, as well as the French. It's only in the last day or so that the European Union has announced that it will be is pulling together a force which will add some additional ships from European countries for action in the Red Sea. But it might be 3 weeks or so before these start operations. Do we have 3 weeks? Well, we're going to have 3 weeks. But in the meantime, we're in a very precarious situation, as illustrated by one of the pieces of news earlier this week, when it emerged that there was a Houthi cruise missile heading towards an American ship, and it was only eventually shot down a mile from the ship. That's rather too close for comfort. So the question that I've been asked to answer or try to answer is, why have our Gulf allies been so reluctant to be involved? And their reluctance is easier to describe than the actual reasoning for this. But the reluctance, for example, is the Saudis are not involved, even though Saudi Arabia is directly impacted by the threat to shipping. Saudi Arabia has a coastline not only on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, whatever you'd like to call it, but of course also on the Red Sea. And it's on the Red Sea that Saudi Arabia's main port city of Jeddah is located. So there is a notional threat to shipping for those which are coming either from Asia through the Bab el-Mandeb into the Red Sea from the south, or from the north via the Suez Canal. A second country which we'd like to be involved is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, which a few years ago was directly involved in Yemen when it was allied with Saudi Arabia in trying to overthrow the Houthi regime. But since the last few years, it's confined its political action to the south of Yemen. There was a time when Yemen was divided into North Yemen and South Yemen. It's now theoretically at least one united country. But the UAE is still involved in the south of Yemen, lending political and a measure of limited military support to the government in Aden, or Aden, depending on your ethnicity, but is otherwise not involved. Saudi Arabia appears to be not involved because it is trying to have peace negotiations with the Houthis. The Saudis went to war with Yemen in early 2016, just after the transition from the late King Abdullah to King Salman, the current king of Saudi Arabia. And he appointed his, what was then very young son, Prince Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, often known as MBS, as defense minister. And MBS essentially went to war with Yemen, clearly hoping for an early success, perhaps within weeks, and didn't have the success. It emerged that, in fact, the Houthi forces, instead of defending Yemen from the Saudis, were actually able to advance into areas of southern Saudi Arabia and to put the Saudis at a disadvantage. But there appears to be some sort of diplomacy going on to sort this out, and the suggestion is that the Saudis don't want to get involved in any military action now because it would jeopardize whatever's going on diplomatically. The other country which I look to as possibly being involved or should be involved is Egypt, at the other end of the Red Sea, where the Suez Canal is, which joins the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. The Egyptians, it could be argued, are suffering the most economically from this action in the Red Sea, because a substantial portion of Egyptian foreign currency revenues comes from the dues they are able to charge to ships transiting the Suez Canal. And number of ships go down, they get less money. The Egyptians, though, have had at least a limited role in what's going on militarily, because one of the British contributions to the military action has been Typhoon fighter bombers which have flown in from a British sovereign base in Cyprus and are refueled over the Red Sea to hit military targets in Yemen before returning, flying over Egypt to Cyprus. So there is an involvement there, but it's arguably not enough. And so the challenge now is to get our allies, or the countries which we thought were going to be military partners in a future regional conflict, to actually step up to the mark. I'm not holding my breath on this. The danger is, and the calculation I suspect they're making is, first of all, they have less than full confidence in the United States, a consequence of, frankly, the Biden administration coming to the end of its first term, and they're not sure how to play their cards on US presidential elections. So we have this hugely difficult situation, and sitting just over the horizon is Iran, sitting there happily twiddling its thumbs and encouraging but denying one of its proxies or another from taking on US forces. The Houthis, of course, are an Iranian proxy, and I was pleased to see today that the Secretary Austin, the Defense Secretary Austin, has put out a public request to Iran to stop supplying weapons to Yemen. I had to look at this twice to make sure it was a real news story. Of course, we want that to happen. The danger is that Iran will just ignore or, frankly, laugh off such a request. And one can't finish talking about Iran without the other ingredient of what Iran's plans might be for the future of the region: Red Sea, Hamas in Gaza, Lebanon, etc. That Iran, we still fear, is on the cusp of being able to develop a viable nuclear weapon. Is the current crisis circumstance to push it closer to that ambition, or is it going to still hold back from fulfilling that ambition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before I turn to your questions, I one of my few privileges as moderators, I get to ask questions. So let me ask each of you a question. First with Noam, why should we care? Why does it matter what's happening to the shipping? Okay, so the costs of shipping gone up a little bit, but frankly, so what? Michael, you said that what we have to do is deplete and defend. How long is this going to take? And what happens if Iran restocks the Houthis, and we find ourselves, instead of depleting and defending, but defending and defending and defending. And finally, Simon, the war involving the Houthis has been going on for quite a while. Back some years ago, there was a lot of criticism in the West of the Saudis and the Emiratis for the war they were conducting against the Houthis. And the Saudis kept saying to us that we were underestimating the Houthis as a problem. Were they right?
I'll start. Okay, I'll go first. Very good question. Why should we care? I will use 2 examples. I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe, and also I'm going to talk a little bit about Egypt, for instance, just examples to understand the impact, given that my colleague Simon mentioned Egypt and the Suez Canal tolls. Europe, for instance, Europe has been facing a lot of crises, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now it has to deal with the changing, trade patterns that are taking place because a lot of vessels are taking the Cape of Good Hope. Europe is dependent on Asia for different commodities. And if you remember, as viewers, the maps I showed earlier, those longer journeys mean higher shipping costs. We're already seeing freight rates soaring, especially in the container segment. And in the end, those higher costs will have to be passed on at one point. We might not be feeling the impact right now, but in the upcoming months, in Q1, in March, and in February and March, we might start feeling increase in prices, and especially if the crisis persists. Because right now we still don't see a clear solution, neither for the attacks in the Red Sea or to the wider conflict. If we move to Egypt, for instance, Egypt, and this was acknowledged by the Suez Canal Authority earlier this month, dollar revenues from the Suez Canal tolls were down by 40% during the 11 days of January. How will Egypt cope with this new situation amid its struggling economy is something to monitor moving forward. So I gave these 2 examples just to show that there is an impact. And on top of that, we have new trade patterns that are taking place. Some players are profiting and others will be losing. So it will be interesting to see how this new maritime trade pattern will evolve moving forward, because you're going to have winners and you're going to have losers at the same time. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Michael.
Thanks very much. So I'll answer your question, Patrick. If you don't mind, can you give me a 2-finger on the Gulf issue after Simon's spoken? Because I got some thoughts on that as well. Containment of the Houthis, like containment anywhere, is a long-term process. It's open-ended. I mean, how long have we been containing Iran? Absent a dialogue of civilizations that worked, the answer is, ever since 1979 and for the foreseeable future, forever. And, realistically with the Houthis, that's what we need to be doing as well. Now, do we need to be shooting down cruise missiles and anti-shipping missiles in the Red Sea constantly and escorting tankers constantly? No, but I think that's because the conflict will end ultimately. It'll end before we find a solution to the Houthis striking these things. But in the meantime, I mean, we're learning the depth of their arsenals. We're probably forcing them to husband their resources a little bit. And we're going to begin to transition into them only having lower level capabilities, such as drones with smaller warheads that honestly, don't stop a ship. And inaccurate missiles, such as, for instance, them using up whatever remaining converted surface to air missile systems they've got, the SA-2s, where they're just basically firing them at a grid of sea. If we affect in any way Iranian spy shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean, we'll reduce that targeting capability even further. And the other thing we could do if we wanted to speed up the process we're depleting is the enemy is to simply strike harder. I mean, we've only done one big strike realistically on January the 12th. If we did 2 or 3 more of those, we'd start to put a significant dent in Houthi arsenals. Instead, we've chosen to be very slow burn about this and quite reactive. But we can always speed it up if we need to.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you, Patrick. First of all, if I could have a go at why should we care? I'd like to refer to a front page story on the Wall Street Journal today, which is entitled "Ship Attacks Threaten a Pillar of Global Trade." The pillar of global trade is the notion that ships, merchant ships, can travel anywhere they want across the world. Merchant ships, container ships are boring to us, but this is the whole process by which IKEA, as the article mentioned, could sell the same sofa in 79 different countries in the world or something. I can't remember the exact detail, but it's a very efficient way of developing the world economy. And this action in the Red Sea is putting that at peril. A bit of additional context is that the article also mentioned, with the help of a map, that other parts of the world where there are these choke points, as they're called, are also facing difficulty. The Strait of Malacca, which seems to always have some sort of pirate action in it, the Taiwan Strait, because of Chinese ambitions, and the Black Sea because of Ukraine and Russia being at war. We don't need a trouble in another choke point. Ironically, of course, at least myself have talked about the most threatened choke point in the world as being the Strait of Hormuz, the exit from the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean. That at the moment is not threatened at all, but that's only a minor bonus in the context. As for the Saudis underestimating or complaining that we've underestimated the problem, I haven't heard that directly from them, but they're the ones who really stirred up the problem, arguably in the first place, by intervening in Yemen and trying to vanquish a nascent Houthi-led coalition regime in Sana'a, and then realized they couldn't do it. And militarily, despite using our best equipment, were unable to defeat the Houthis, which is why they have now reverted to diplomatic action to try and sort out the issue. So that's a sort of I told you so judgment, which doesn't necessarily stand up to examination.
Thank you. So let me turn now to questions that we're getting coming in. One, is Iran maintaining a ship in the area that provides intelligence to the Houthis? And if so, wouldn't this be a natural target?
Sure. If you go back to Washington Institute coverage of Yemen in 2018, we identified the spy ship, which then was the Safiz, as an ideal target to be destroyed. It was then subsequently destroyed by the Israelis, or at least it was damaged and had to leave the region. The new version of that is called the Beshad. I spent a lot of time looking at these ships. They are, in theory, anti-piracy motherships that the Iranians keep with a bunch of fast attack craft. And you, in theory, if you're an Iranian or a Syrian ship, you check in with them on the way in to the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and you check out at the other end. And what they actually are roach motels for the Revolutionary Guard. They always come in with the ships' crews far larger than they need to be, coming either from Iran or from Lebanon or Syria. They offload a bunch of personnel and they take back on board a bunch of personnel as the IRGC and Lebanese Hezbollah trainers use the ships to rotate in and out of theatre. They are also used as a place to drop off munitions that can then be brought in, or specialized equipment that can then be brought into Yemen with the personnel. And they're also used as electronic intelligence gathering platforms that are used to keep an eye on shipping in the Red Sea. They were first put in place when the Houthis fought their first war against the Saudis in Yemen in 2009 to 2010. That's when the Iranians first started taking an interest. If I may, I asked to have a two-finger on this issue of the Gulf navies or the Gulf involvement. I would just say two things. And, me and Simon typically have differing views on whether our Gulf partners are doing enough or not. First of all, the Houthis are not defending Yemen. They are defending their coup against the UN-backed government in September 2014. The Saudis did not start the war in 2015. The UN-backed government of Yemen requested military assistance from the United Nations, citing the right of self-defense, and from the Arab League when the Houthis tried to overrun the rest of the country, including Hodeidah coast, including the oil and gas fields at Marib, and including the largest port in the south of the country in Aden. That, first of all, I'd say, there is one Yemeni government, and it's not the Houthis. They happen to be occupying the most populous part of the country in the northwest, and they happen to have inherited the majority of the crummy Yemeni military. But they're not the government, and they're not defending Yemen, and they're not Yemen. The second thing I'd say is that, if someone would ask me, well, why are the Gulf states not participating? I would say, well, because we stopped them from removing Houthi control of the Red Sea coast, which would have prevented the Houthis from undertaking fast attack, helicopter, mine, anti-shipping missile attacks on the Red Sea. When they were 90% of the way doing that in Hodeidah in 2018, the US and the UK, the same people who now have to police the Red Sea, stop them from completing the task. And so, I think it's absolutely right that the US and the UK should have this burden because we deserve it. Ultimately, we stopped them from doing this job. We crucified them in Congress. We stopped sale of offensive arms to them because they're doing exactly what we're doing right now. And, that is an indictment of our policy. So short-sighted, so thoughtless, and we're paying the price for it now. So if the Gulf states say, I told you so, they have absolutely every right to do so. We would not have this Houthi threat against global shipping right now if we had simply stayed out of the way in 2018.
If I could just briefly add another factoid there. The United Nations recognized government of Yemen unfortunately doesn't live in Yemen. It lives in a hotel room in Riyadh, the Saudi capital. And so we have complicating the diplomacy is that it has no power and no influence and just exists in the name. The reality is, unfortunately, that the Houthis occupy not the whole of Yemen, but the northwestern chunk of it, which is where most of the population live.
True, but let me just say this. During the Second World War, we had numerous partner governments who were living in London, and we recognized them as the official governments of their countries. We did not recognize the Nazis as the official governments of their countries. And we continued to support them until such time as they returned to power within their countries.
Interesting exchange. I'm moving on to a different question. Can you talk about the potential role of China in addressing the Houthi threat? And does it have an interest in doing so? Noam.
Well, I cannot talk about what China can do exactly, but what we know based on what we observe in the changing trade patterns is that some Chinese companies have been affected, yes. And for instance, COSCO shipping, we've seen ships also taking the long haul around the Cape of Good Hope. And at the same time, we've also seen and reportedly some Chinese also operators are operating in the Red Sea, moving between ports of Djibouti, for instance, Djibouti, Hodeidah, Yemen, and Jeddah. So we do have shipping companies, Chinese shipping companies being affected. How will China address that? I don't have an answer for it, but we've seen China making statements recently, calling, if I'm not mistaken, for an end or for the attacks to cease. But what can they do exactly politically? I don't have an answer to that. If my colleagues have an answer, go ahead. Or you, Patrick.
Or Michael, if you could also say a few words about the Chinese military presence in the region.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask Noam actually, is that, the Chinese have got a military facility in Djibouti. They've got a couple of surface combatants sitting in the Gulf of Aden at the moment, right? Do you actually see them escorting their ships or any ships?
Uh, if I'm not mistaken, at least one report did mention a Navy escort, if I'm not mistaken, and at the same time, ships are resorting to on defense mechanism, like using razor wires. Those are operating
anti-piracy type stuff
in the Red Sea. So this is, I would say, is happening. But how much would it also help other bigger shipping companies to come back to the region? That's something to monitor, because again, bigger companies like COSCO shipping and probably others, they are diverting ships around the Cape of Good Hope, and even halting some companies in China, halting trade routes with Israeli ports too. So.
And so from a great power competition perspective, do you see the Houthis giving any kind of easy pass for Chinese or Russian or Iranian or
I would
shipping?
say they're actually probably taking advantage of what we may call their immunity, probably to Houthi attacks. That could be, yes. Even we've seen, for instance, take like ships carrying like Russian oil, right? We've seen some of them also broadcasting no, quote unquote, no ties or no relation with Israel, and they're moving through the Red Sea. So yeah, I would say some players are, I would say, taking advantage of what they may see as immunity to Houthi attacks, to answer your question, Mark. Yeah.
To add to that, China, of course, its economy depends on international trade, and so it has an interest, arguably much greater interest than, say, Russia has in what's going on in the Red Sea. So they have a vote to cast, and the vote cast as a moment, and of course it could change, is that the Houthis aren't going against Chinese forces or Chinese ships. And diplomatically, perhaps this is a way of engaging China so that it realizes the bigger issue at stake, which is global free trade, rather than the US versus Iran versus proxies.
If you don't mind, just one thing just to add. Thank you, Simon, for very important points. With respect to Russia, something we need to also just keep in mind that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, trade flows did change, meaning we are seeing more flows of Russian oil moving away from Europe, right, due to the sanctions on Russia's oil industry and moving to Asia. And that's why we are seeing how important the Red Sea route is for Russian oil, because that is going to India, for instance, and that's going also to China, both crude and products. So it's something also just to keep in mind when we look at Russia.
We haven't said very much about the Gaza war. I'd be interested in hearing from all of you about how you think the Gaza war has influenced all of this. To what extent are the Houthi attacks, in fact, motivated by showing what they can do to help the Palestinians? And for that matter, what impact are the Houthi attacks having on the Palestinians, the Palestinian conflict? Is it fair to say that the Houthi attacks have increased pressure for a ceasefire in the Gaza war? To what extent is the Saudi and Emirati reluctance, the Egyptian reluctance to get involved, because of a perception that if they did get involved, that would be defending Israeli interests that are what the Houthis are attacking?
Who would like to go first?
Well, Mike probably knows it off by heart, but the Houthi slogan is death to America, death to Israel, etc., etc. When the Houthis say that they're taking this action because of what's happening in Gaza, at least rhetorically, I think they're making a valid, consistent with their rhetoric point. But it's a mere excuse. And causes us to have a discussion of it here on the table and in chancelleries of foreign ministries all over the world. But the fact of the matter is that the Houthis don't want Israel to exist at all, Gaza or no Gaza. And of course, this is also the position of the Iranians as well.
Yeah, the Houthis, look, from my perspective, it's very tightly tied. But, really in the way that Simon's talking about, which is that, the Houthis, right the way back to the late 90s, have been just vehemently anti-Israeli. And some of that goes back to the developments they went through during, I guess it was the second Intifada. And then 9/11 and then Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. All during that period, they firmed up the slogan and they firmed up, their inherent hostility to Israel. And let's face it, that's a hostility that exists across a lot of the Arab world and particularly within Yemen. The thing is, none of the Houthis and the anti-Houthi factions would not be very far apart right now on Israel or Gaza, honestly. That's the reality of it. So they're being good Yemenis at the same time as being good members of the Axis of Resistance. They just go a lot further than other Yemeni groups. I think that the Houthis are only doing what they're doing against global shipping right now because of the Gaza war. They were told by Khamenei publicly, they and all the other Axis resistance members, to begin affecting global shipping. And a second call went out recently, and the Iraqi militias answered Khamenei's individual call then to, for instance, affect northern Israeli ports by starting to fire drones at northern Israeli ports like Ashdod. So, we had an initial call for maritime attacks and broadening against trade, and the Houthis answered that. And we had a second one recently, and the Iraqis answered that. If he says stop it, they'll stop it. The Houthis want to demonstrate they like the Axis of Resistance. I think a lot of the Axis of Resistance members would think that what happened since October 7th was a real pain. They would say, Lebanese Hezbollah would say, wow, you nearly killed us there, Hamas. We'll be lucky if we get out of this intact. The Iraqi militias have tried to pretend to be with Hamas, but they don't really care about Hamas, and they ultimately don't want to get killed, which is one of the reasons why they just did a ceasefire, and they don't want the Iranians to get bombed. The Iranians have done practically nothing to help. The Houthis are the only ones who have really wholeheartedly jumped in with both feet and said, not only do we have less to lose, not only are we more risk averse, risk tolerant, pain tolerant, but we really believe it. We really want to help. I mean, I think they have more solidarity with Hamas than pretty much any other member of the Axis of Resistance. They recognize something in them, that they want to destroy Israel. So, for me, they're there to demonstrate that the Houthis did what they were supposed to do as members of the Axis of Resistance. And they're, a bit of an eager beaver. They're a bit more into it than the other members. But nonetheless, when it stops, when the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah say power down, they will.
Based what I've been focusing on at the beginning, when we saw the first attack on Galaxy Leader, the ship that remains in Yemen, we did think it was very much linked to the conflict between Hamas and Israel. But then later on, when once they started carrying out more attacks, the Israeli links started becoming very vague. It became very difficult to trace those Israeli links. And the Houthis, up until now, they keep saying that the ships they are attacking are going to Israeli ports. That's not true. I'll give you an example. Sama Sejam Taj is a ship operated by the French company. If I'm not mistaken, she was targeted early January. That ship continued, after being attacked, continued sailing, went to Egypt, and then she ended up in Lebanon. And Lebanon and Israel are technically two countries technically at war. So not all those ships are going to. I don't know if there is one ship that ended up in Israel. Based on our observation, one of them was supposed to go to Israel in the next month, and that was targeted. But now they are widening their targets. There are more after, it seems, ships with US and UK links. So it's very difficult now to say that they are only targeting ships linked to the conflict. Because again, after the US-UK strikes on January the 12th, it seems that the Houthis are more after ships that have links to UK and US. And let's bear in mind that ships that have links to Israel right now are definitely not thinking of going through the region. So, so this is something to bear in mind.
Right,
they wouldn't risk their companies, and wouldn't risk the lives of their own seafarers too.
I mean, target scarcity is going to be an issue for them,
That's
right?
a good point.
And so, but if you look at the Houthis, they've Mohammed Abdul Salam, who is the Houthi Westerner whisperer, who sits in Oman and chats up Western think tankers and US congressional figures. He said, we're going to stop this when Gaza stops. And for once, he's probably telling the truth. Because, the fact is, they don't want to be seen as a bunch of pirates who just attack shipping because they enjoy it, or because they want to be the new Barbary Coast pirates of the Red Sea. He's saying, no, it's linked to the Gaza war. And if you can stop Gaza, we'll stop. And, when the Gaza war ends one day, one thing you can guarantee is that every Axis resistance member would say, it was our contribution that did it. Israel would have kept going for another 5 years if we hadn't stood up and stopped them, which is ridiculous. But that'll be the first thing they say. And the Houthis will probably have better claim than any of the rest of them. They'll certainly have better evidence to point to that they made a significant contribution.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you all for making a significant contribution today for our understanding of the situation with the Houthis. And I'm afraid to say that my conclusion from listening to you is that this is not a problem which is likely to go away anytime soon. It's partly based on my pessimism that there's going to be a clear end to the Gaza conflict anytime soon. And I think that the Houthis are finding what they're doing now is really quite a useful way to gain support at home and also to gain more attention abroad. So I don't know if I speak for you all, but I personally suspect that we're going to have an opportunity to discuss this issue again in the future. And so thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Patrick.
And thank you for your questions.